10 men were going to fall out of the sky in the next 15 minutes. A flak burst had torn a 6-foot hole in the fuselage, ripped through the hydraulic lines, and turned the B-24's control cables into shredded wire. 800 miles of open ocean stood between them and the nearest airfield, and the only thing that could save them was a roll of aluminum tape that every other engineer on the base had called a waste of cargo space. Not a spare part, not a patch kit. Tape, the kind mechanics used to seal ductwork. Staff Sergeant Vincent "Vinny" Moretti had been carrying that roll in his toolkit for 6 months, and every crew chief who'd seen it had laughed at him. Tape doesn't fix airplanes, they said. Tape is for amateurs. Vinny wasn't a pilot. He wasn't an officer. He was a 26-year-old flight engineer from Newark who'd spent 10 years fixing cars in his uncle's body shop before the war. He didn't know aerodynamics. He didn't know engineering theory. He knew how to make broken things work long enough to get home. What he did over the next 4 hours would keep a plane in the air that should have crashed into the Pacific. He would patch control cables with tape and wire. He would seal a hydraulic line with nothing but pressure and faith. He would hold a bomber together with his bare hands while 10 men flew 800 miles to safety. And the technique he invented would save dozens of aircraft before the war ended. July 1944, the Pacific Theater. B-24 liberators were flying 1,000-mile missions over open ocean to hit Japanese targets, and the ocean didn't forgive mechanical failure. If something broke over the water, you either fixed it in the air or you died. There were no emergency landing strips, no rescue ships, just endless blue in every direction. The flight engineers were the last line of defense. Their job was to keep the plane flying no matter what. And no matter what meant improvising with whatever they had on board. Most engineers carried spare fuses, extra wire, a few hand tools, standard equipment for standard problems. But Vinny Moretti had been laughed at for carrying something else, and before he could save anyone, he'd have to prove that the thing everyone mocked was the only thing that could keep them alive. Vinny learned mechanics in his uncle's body shop in Newark, working on cars that nobody else could fix. The customers who came to Sal's Auto were poor. They couldn't afford new parts, couldn't afford to replace what was broken. They needed someone who could make a dead engine run with baling wire and prayer. Sal taught him the first rule of real repair work. The right part is whatever part you have. A radiator hose could be patched with tape and a hose clamp. A cracked manifold could be sealed with metal paste. The factory manual told you what should work. Experience told you what would work. Pretty doesn't matter. Running matters. Get it running, get it home. Worry about pretty later. When he enlisted, the Army took one look at his mechanical background and made him a flight engineer. The B-24 was the most complicated machine he'd ever worked on. 4 engines, miles of wiring, hydraulic systems, fuel systems, oxygen systems. Everything had to work perfectly at 20,000 feet in freezing temperatures. The training taught him the official procedures. Vinny learned something else on his own. The procedures assumed you had parts and time. In combat, you had neither. He started collecting things. A roll of aluminum tape he'd found in a supply depot. Extra lengths of wire, metal clamps of various sizes, rubber patches, anything that might someday be the difference between flying and falling. The other engineers laughed. The crew chief told him he was wasting weight on junk. Vinny kept collecting anyway. The mission on July 19th was a long-range strike against Japanese shipping. 12 hours in the air, most of it over open water. The target was heavily defended. Everyone knew they'd take flak. The question was how much. The answer came over the target. A burst caught them just as the bombs released, close enough to feel the shockwave, close enough to hear the shrapnel punching through aluminum. The plane lurched, warning lights flashed across the engineer's panel, and Vinny heard a sound he'd been dreading for 6 months, the scream of wind through a hole that shouldn't exist. The damage was worse than anyone realized. and what Vinny found when he went to inspect it should have killed them all. The flak had torn through the aft fuselage like a giant fist. There was a hole in the skin big enough for a man to fall through. The waist gunner had nearly gone out before he grabbed a stanchion. But the hole wasn't the real problem. The real problem was what the shrapnel had hit on its way through. The main hydraulic line was severed. Without hydraulics, they had no brakes, no flaps, limited control surface movement. The elevator cable, the cable that controlled whether the nose went up or down, was half cut through, hanging by a few strands of wire that could snap at any moment. And one of the oxygen lines was leaking, which meant they couldn't stay at a high altitude much longer. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, tight with forced calm. "Vinny, what do we have?" Vinny looked at the damage. He thought about the 800 miles of ocean between them and home. He thought about the 10 men whose lives depended on what he did in the next few minutes. "Give me 20 minutes and don't touch the controls unless you have to." The elevator cable was the most critical. If it snapped, the plane would nose down and they'd hit the ocean in seconds. Vinny didn't have a replacement cable. He didn't have a splice kit. He had wire, clamps, and tape. He wrapped the damaged section with wire first, binding the frayed strands together as tightly as he could. Then he wound the aluminum tape around the wire, layer after layer, building up a reinforced sleeve that would hold the cable together. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't regulation, but it might hold. He tested it by having the pilot make a tiny adjustment to the elevator. The cable held, for now. The hydraulic line was harder. Fluid was spraying everywhere, making the deck slick and dangerous. Standard procedure said a severed hydraulic line couldn't be repaired in flight. You just accepted the loss and flew without hydraulics. Vinny didn't accept it. His first attempt to seal the line failed. The tape wouldn't hold against the pressure. The hydraulic fluid just pushed it off. His second attempt failed too, the patch blowing out almost immediately. The other crew members were watching him now, their faces pale, waiting for the engineer to admit what everyone was thinking. This was impossible. Vinny didn't admit anything. He thought about Sal's body shop, about the impossible repairs they'd done with nothing but creativity and stubbornness. There was always a way. You just had to find it. The third attempt worked. He clamped the line above and below the tear to reduce pressure, then built up a plug of tape and rubber potches that could handle the reduced flow. It wasn't full hydraulics. They'd have maybe half power to the brakes and flaps, but it was something. The oxygen line was simpler. A wrap of tape, a prayer, and they could maintain altitude for another few hours. Not comfortable, but survivable. But the repairs were just the beginning. 800 miles is a long way to fly in a plane held together with tape. In somewhere over the Pacific, Vinny's patchwork started to fail. The elevator cable patch started slipping after 2 hours. Vinny felt the vibration change, saw the tape beginning to unwind under the constant stress. He crawled back to the repair and reinforced it, adding more wire, more tape, his fingers numb from the cold at altitude. An hour later, the hydraulic patch blew out. Fluid sprayed across the compartment. Vinny rebuilt it in the dark, by feel, while the plane bounced through turbulence and the pilot fought to maintain control with failing systems. He made repairs 7 times during that flight. Each time the patches held a little less long. Each time he found a way to make them hold a little longer. The roll of tape that everyone had laughed at was almost gone by the time they saw the coastline. The landing was the final test. Half hydraulics meant the brakes would barely work. The flops were stuck at partial extension. The elevator cable was holding by sheer force of will and aluminum tape. The pilot came in low and slow, using every inch of runway. Vinny stood in the fuselage, watching his patches, ready to call out if anything gave way. The wheels touched. The brakes grabbed, barely. The plane rolled and rolled, slowing gradually, until it finally stopped at the very end of the strip. 10 men climbed out of a bomber that should have been at the bottom of the Pacific. The maintenance crew looked at the damage and couldn't believe the plane had made it back. When they saw the repairs, the tape, the wire, the improvised patches, they stopped laughing at Vinnie Moretti's toolkit. The engineering officer wrote up Vinnie's techniques and distributed them across the Pacific theater. The aluminum tape repair method became standard equipment on B-24s. Every flight engineer started carrying a roll. The hydraulic patch technique saved at least a dozen aircraft over the next year, planes that would have been lost without Vinnie's improvisation. Vinnie flew 31 more missions before the war ended. He never lost a plane, never had a crew member die from mechanical failure. The pilots requested him specifically. They wanted the engineer who could fix anything with tape and wire and sheer Jersey stubbornness. After the war, he went back to Newark, took over his uncle's body shop when Sal retired, spent 40 years fixing cars that nobody else could fix, using techniques that would have made factory engineers cringe. He kept the empty roll of tape from that mission on a shelf in the shop. When customers asked about it, he'd just shrug and say it was a souvenir. He never told them the whole story. He never told them that a roll of tape held 10 men alive across 800 miles of empty ocean. He died in 1994 at 76 years old. His obituary mentioned the body shop, his children, his 50 years in the same Newark neighborhood. It didn't mention the Pacific. It didn't mention the B-24. It didn't mention that a mechanic from Jersey did the impossible with the one tool everyone said was useless. The records exist if you know where to look. Maintenance reports that document the repairs, training manuals that still reference the Moretti method, and somewhere in Newark, an empty roll of aluminum tape that once held a bomber together across 800 miles of ocean. That's the story they never told you. That's the missing page. If you want more stories like this, you know what to do.